I had barely stepped through the door when I felt something was off. The air was thick with tension, like the calm before a storm. My mother, Lorraine, was sitting at the kitchen table, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her coffee cup. She looked up as I entered, and her eyes were red-rimmed, a stark contrast to her usual serene demeanor. "Morgan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk." My heart skipped a beat. This was not the usual welcome home I expected. I dropped my bag by the door and pulled out a chair, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the tile floor. "What is it, Mom?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She took a deep breath, her gaze meeting mine with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "Your father, Russell. He's been seeing someone else." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My father, the man I had always seen as a rock, was having an affair? I felt the room spin for a moment, my mind struggling to process the revelation. "Who?" I managed to ask, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Her name is Celeste," Lorraine replied, her voice steady now, though her hands shook slightly. She's much younger." I leaned back in my chair, trying to wrap my head around this new reality. My father, the architect who had always seemed larger than life, had fallen for someone nearly my age. The betrayal cut deep, and I could feel a mix of disbelief and anger bubbling up inside me. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "A few months," she admitted. "I found out by accident. He wasn't careful." I could see the pain etched on her face, and it made my blood boil. How could he do this to her? To us? I stood up abruptly, the chair clattering to the ground behind me. "I need to talk to him," I said, my mind already racing with what I would say. Lorraine nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Just be careful, Morgan. He's not the same person right now." I nodded, my mind made up. I grabbed my phone and stepped outside, needing the fresh air to clear my head. I dialed his number, my fingers trembling slightly as I pressed the call button. The phone rang a few times before he picked up. "Morgan," he said, his voice sounding almost normal, as if nothing had happened. "Where are you, Dad?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm at the office," he replied, though there was a hesitation that made me doubt his words. "Can we meet?" "There's something we need to talk about," I said, not giving him a chance to refuse. There was a pause, and I could almost hear him weighing his options. "All right," he finally said. "I'll be home in an hour." I hung up, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. I knew this confrontation was going to be difficult, but I needed to do it. Not just for my mother, but for myself. I couldn't let him get away with this without facing the consequences. As I waited, I thought about Celeste. Who is she, really? What kind of person gets involved with a married man, knowing the pain it would cause? I realized I didn't know much about her, but I was determined to find out. When my father finally walked through the door, I was ready. "We need to talk," I said, crossing my arms as I stood in the living room. He looked at me, his expression a mix of guilt and defiance. "I know what this is about," he said, his voice carrying a hint of resignation. "Do you?" I shot back, my anger barely contained. "Do you really understand what you've done?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Morgan, it's complicated." "Complicated?" I echoed, incredulous. "You betrayed Mom. You betrayed us. How is that complicated?" He didn't answer immediately, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. "I've been unhappy for a long time," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, unable to believe what I was hearing. "So that's your excuse? You think that justifies everything?" He looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way." I felt a surge of frustration and sadness. This wasn't the father I knew. Or maybe I never really knew him at all. As I stood there, grappling with the reality of my family's disintegration, I realized this was just the beginning. I was determined to uncover the truth behind Celeste's intentions and save what was left of my family. But as I watched my father, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were going to get a lot more complicated. The next morning, I found myself pacing the kitchen, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Lorraine was already up, calmly preparing breakfast as if the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. I admired her composure but couldn't help wondering how she managed to keep it together. Coffee, she asked, her voice gentle but steady. Please, I replied, sinking into a chair. I watched her pour the steaming liquid, her movements deliberate and soothing. How are you holding up? She gave me a small, reassuring smile. I'm all right, Morgan. I've had time to process. It's you I'm worried about. I took a sip of coffee, the bitterness grounding me. I just don't understand how he could do this. And with someone like Celeste. Lorraine nodded, her eyes distant. People change, sometimes in ways we don't expect. But it doesn't mean we have to change with them. Her words were a balm, but my anger still simmered beneath the surface. I needed answers, and I knew my father wasn't going to give them willingly. As if on cue, he walked into the kitchen, looking more haggard than I'd ever seen him. Morning, he said, trying for casual, but his voice cracked slightly. Morning, I replied coolly, not ready to let him off the hook. Lorraine handed him a cup of coffee, and he took it gratefully. We should talk, he said, glancing between us. I crossed my arms, leaning back in my chair. Yeah, we should. He sighed, setting his cup down with a clink. I know you're upset, Morgan. But this isn't just about Celeste. It's about me finding happiness. Happiness? I echoed, incredulous. At the expense of your family? Lorraine placed a hand on my arm, a silent reminder to keep my emotions in check. Russell ran a hand through his hair, looking more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. I felt trapped for years, he admitted. Celeste. She makes me feel alive again. I shook my head, disbelief mingling with frustration. And what about Mom? What about us? He opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to escape him. Instead, he looked at Lorraine, his eyes pleading. I never meant to hurt you. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. I know, Russell. But intentions don't erase the damage. The silence that followed was heavy, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I could see the cracks in our family's foundation, and I wasn't sure how to mend them. But one thing was clear, I couldn't let Celeste get away with this. Later that day, I decided to visit Celeste. I needed to see for myself who this woman was and what hold she had over my father. Her apartment was in a trendy part of town, the kind of place that screamed style over substance. I knocked on the door, my heart pounding in my chest. Celeste answered, looking surprised to see me. Morgan, right? She asked, her voice smooth and confident. That's right, I replied, forcing a smile. Can we talk? She hesitated, then stepped aside to let me in. Her place was immaculate, filled with sleek furniture and modern art. It felt like a showroom, not a home. Nice place, I commented, trying to keep the conversation light. Thanks, she said, gesturing for me to sit. What brings you here? I sat down, clasping my hands in my lap. I wanted to understand what you see in my father. She tilted her head, studying me with an amused smile. He's a good man, Morgan. He just needed someone to remind him of that. Her words were like a slap to the face, but I kept my composure. And you think you're that someone? She shrugged, her confidence unwavering. We all have our roles to play. I leaned forward, meeting her gaze head-on. And what's yours exactly? For a moment, her facade slipped, revealing a flicker of uncertainty. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. I'm just trying to be happy, same as anyone. I stood up, my resolve strengthening. I hope you find what you're looking for, Celeste. But not at my family's expense. As I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than met the eye. Her confidence seemed too rehearsed, her charm too calculated. I needed to dig deeper, to uncover whatever secrets she was hiding. Back at home, Lorraine was waiting for me, her expression one of quiet strength. Did you find what you were looking for? She asked. Not yet, I admitted. But I will. She nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. Remember, Morgan, sometimes the truth is more complicated than we expect. Her words lingered with me, a reminder that this journey was far from over. I was determined to protect my family, no matter what it took. But as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to uncover something that would change everything. The days that followed felt like I was living in a fog, each moment tinged with the weight of the truth I had uncovered. I threw myself into work, hoping the rhythm of urban planning could drown out the chaos at home. But even as I drafted blueprints and attended meetings, The thought of Celeste's manipulations gnawed at me. One evening, as I was packing up to leave the office, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Ethan, asking if I wanted to grab a drink. I hesitated, then replied with a quick yes. I needed a distraction, and Ethan's company was always a welcome one. We met at a small bar near my office, the kind of place where the low lighting and soft music made it easy to forget the outside world. Ethan was already there, nursing a beer. He smiled as I approached, a warmth in his eyes that made my heart lift, if only for a moment. "How's it going?" he asked, his voice gentle. I shrugged, sliding onto the stool beside him. "It's been a week." He nodded, understanding without prying. That was one of the things I appreciated most about Ethan, his ability to be present without demanding answers. "I heard about a new project you're working on. Sounds exciting." I smiled, grateful for the change of subject. We talked about work, the conversation flowing easily. But eventually, the topic circled back to my family. Ethan leaned forward, his expression serious. "Have you had any more run-ins with Celeste?" I shook my head, a sigh escaping my lips. "Not since I visited her. But I'm still trying to figure out her angle." Ethan frowned, his brow furrowing in thought. I've heard some things about her. Rumors, mostly." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Like what?" "Apparently, she's been involved with other men before," he said cautiously. "Older, successful men. It's like she has a pattern." A cold chill ran down my spine. This was the confirmation I needed, a piece of the puzzle that made everything click into place. "That makes sense," I murmured, my mind racing. "She's been playing my father, using his insecurities against him." Ethan nodded, his gaze steady. "You need to be careful, Morgan. She might be more dangerous than she seems." I appreciated his concern, but I was more determined than ever. "I have to do something, Ethan. I can't let her destroy my family." He reached over, squeezing my hand. "I know you will. Just remember, you're not alone in this." His support was a balm, but I knew the next steps were mine to take. As I left the bar that night, a plan began to form in my mind. I needed to gather more evidence, something concrete that would force my father to see the truth. The opportunity came sooner than expected. A few days later, I received an unexpected call from Lorraine. "Morgan, there's something you should know," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. "What is it?" I asked, my pulse quickening. "Celeste has been asking about your father's finances," she revealed. "She's been very interested in his investments." This was the twist I needed, a revelation that added another layer to Celeste's scheme. If she was after his money, it meant her intentions were far more sinister than I'd imagined. I thanked Lorraine and hung up, my mind racing with possibilities. I decided to confront Celeste again, this time armed with the knowledge of her past and her interest in my father's wealth. I called her, arranging to meet at a coffee shop. As I waited, I rehearsed what I would say, my resolve hardening with each passing moment. When Celeste arrived, she looked as polished as ever, her confidence unshaken. "Morgan," she greeted, sliding into the seat opposite me. "What's this about?" I leaned forward, my gaze steady. "I know about your past, Celeste. And I know you're after my father's money." Her eyes flickered, a brief crack in her facade. But she quickly composed herself, a smile playing on her lips. "You've been busy, haven't you?" "I'm not going to let you manipulate him any longer," I said, my voice firm. "I have enough to expose you." She leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "You're a lot like your father, determined, but blinded by your own convictions." Her words stung, but I didn't let them deter me. "This isn't about me, Celeste. It's about protecting my family." She shrugged, as if unconcerned. "You do what you have to do, Morgan. But remember, every action has consequences." As I left the coffee shop, her warning echoed in my mind. I was more determined than ever to bring her down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The stakes were higher now, and I needed to be ready for whatever came next. The offer came out of nowhere, neatly packaged in an email with a subject line that read like a lifeline: "Exciting opportunity in urban development." I sat at my desk, staring at the screen, my mind a jumble of what-ifs and maybes. A position in a new city, a fresh start away from the chaos that had engulfed my family. It was tempting, a chance to escape the mess that Celeste had woven around us. But as I sat there, the weight of my decision pressed down on me. Could I really leave Lorraine to deal with the fallout? Could I abandon my father to Celeste's machinations? My phone buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. It was a text from Lorraine. "Dinner tonight? We need to talk." I arrived at my parents' house to find Lorraine in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with a focus that betrayed the storm beneath her calm exterior. "Smells good," I said, trying to lighten the mood. She glanced up, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Thanks. I thought we could use a nice meal." I nodded, taking a seat at the table. "You wanted to talk?" She set the knife down, wiping her hands on a towel. "Yes. I've been thinking about everything that's happened, and I've come to a decision." My heart skipped a beat. "What kind of decision?" Lorraine took a deep breath, meeting my gaze with a steady resolve. "I'm going to file for divorce." The words hung in the air, a declaration that shifted everything. I hadn't expected this, not from her. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. "I've given it a lot of thought, Morgan. Your father has made his choices, and now I need to make mine." I reached across the table, taking her hand in mine. "I'm proud of you, Mom. Whatever you need, I'm here." She squeezed my hand, a silent acknowledgement of the bond between us. But even as I supported her decision, a part of me felt the ground shifting beneath my feet. This was a turning point, a moment that forced me to reevaluate my own goals. Later that evening, I found myself wandering the streets, lost in thought. The city lights blurred as I pondered the offer, the possibilities it presented. I was so absorbed in my thoughts that I almost didn't notice Ethan until he called my name. "Morgan," he said, jogging up to me, his breath visible in the cool night air. "You all right?" I nodded, though my mind was far from settled. Just a lot on my mind. He fell into step beside me, his presence comforting. "Want to talk about it?" I hesitated, then decided to share the news. "I got a job offer. In another city." Ethan's expression shifted, a mix of surprise and something else I couldn't quite place. "Wow, that's big." "Yeah," I agreed, kicking a pebble down the sidewalk. "I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm being pulled in two directions." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "It's a tough decision. But whatever you choose, it has to be what's right for you." His words resonated, but they didn't make the choice any easier. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving would mean abandoning my family when they needed me most. The next morning, I was jolted awake by a call from Russell. His voice was frantic, a far cry from the calm, composed man I knew. "Morgan, you need to come to the office." Now. I dressed quickly, my mind racing with possibilities. When I arrived, Russell was pacing his office, his usual confidence replaced by a palpable anxiety. "What's going on?" I asked, closing the door behind me. He looked up, his eyes filled with a desperation I'd never seen before. "Celeste. She's threatening to go public with some very personal information if I don't give her what she wants." My stomach dropped. This was the twist I hadn't anticipated, a new level of manipulation that changed everything. "What does she want?" "Money," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "A lot of it." I took a deep breath, trying to process the implications. "You can't give in to her, Dad. If you do, she'll have even more power over you." He nodded, but I could see the fear in his eyes. "I don't know what to do, Morgan. I'm trapped." This was the moment that forced me to reevaluate everything. The stakes were higher now, and I had to act. I couldn't let Celeste destroy what was left of our family. But even as I resolved to fight back, the question of my own future loomed large. Could I really stay, knowing the cost, or was it time to forge my own path? As I left his office, I knew the next steps would define not just my family's future, but my own. The decision to let Celeste stay in my apartment was supposed to be strategic, a way to expose her true colors to my father. But as I stood in the doorway, watching her move in with a smug smile, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a colossal mistake. "Thanks for this, Morgan," Celeste said, her voice dripping with insincere gratitude. "It means a lot to Russell." I forced a tight smile, my stomach churning. "Just remember, it's temporary." She waved a hand dismissively, as if my concerns were trivial. Of course. I'm just here to help Russell see things clearly. Her words were like nails on a chalkboard, but I bit back my retort. I needed to play the long game, even if it meant giving her an inch now. As she settled in, I couldn't help but feel like I was handing over a piece of my life to the enemy. Later that evening, I met Ethan for coffee, hoping his presence would ground me. He listened patiently as I vented about Celeste, his quiet support a balm to my frayed nerves. I just don't get it, I said, stirring my drink absently. Why can't my father see what she's doing? Ethan leaned back, considering my words. Sometimes people see what they want to see. Maybe he's too deep in it to recognize the truth. I sighed, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I thought letting her stay would help, but now I'm not so sure. He reached across the table, his hand warm against mine. You're doing your best, Morgan. But maybe it's time to think about what you need too. His words struck a chord, echoing the internal struggle I'd been grappling with. The job offer loomed large in my mind, a tempting escape from the chaos. But could I really walk away now, when everything was hanging by a thread? As if sensing my turmoil, Ethan changed the subject, steering the conversation to lighter topics. But even as we laughed and talked, my mind kept circling back to the decision I had to make. The next day, I returned to my apartment to find it transformed. Celeste had redecorated, her style clashing with my own in a way that felt like an invasion. I clenched my fists, anger simmering beneath the surface. This was my space, my sanctuary, and she was treating it like her own. I found her in the living room, casually flipping through a magazine. "What's all this?" I asked, gesturing to the new decor. She looked up, feigning innocence. "Oh, I thought I'd make it more homey. I hope you don't mind." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my frustration in check. "This isn't your home, Celeste. You're just a guest." She smiled, a hint of challenge in her eyes. "Of course. But you know how it is, sometimes you have to make a place your own to feel comfortable." Her words were a thinly veiled threat, a reminder that she was more entrenched than I'd anticipated. I needed to act, and soon, before she tightened her grip on my father and my life. That evening, as I sat in the now unfamiliar confines of my apartment, my phone buzzed with a message from Lorraine. "Can you come over? I have something to show you." Curiosity piqued. I headed to my parents' house. Lorraine greeted me with a folder in hand, her expression serious. "I've been doing some digging," she said, handing me the folder. Inside were documents detailing Celeste's past relationships, each one eerily similar to her involvement with Russell. It was a pattern, a calculated game she played with vulnerable men. "This is it," I said, my voice filled with a mix of relief and determination. "This is what we need to show Dad." Lorraine nodded, her eyes filled with resolve. "It's time he knows the truth." The following day, I arranged to meet Russell at his office. My heart pounded as I laid the documents before him, watching as realization dawned in his eyes. "She's been doing this for years," I explained, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." He stared at the papers, his face a mask of disbelief. I can't believe I didn't see it. I placed a hand on his arm, offering support. "It's not too late, Dad. You can still put an end to this." His gaze met mine, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Thank you, Morgan. I don't know what I would have done without you." As I left his office, a sense of purpose filled me. I was closer to breaking free from Celeste's grip, but the path was still fraught with uncertainty. The decision about the job offer loomed, a reminder that my future was still undecided. But for now, I was ready to fight for my family, no matter the cost. Returning to my apartment felt like stepping into a stranger's home. Celeste had taken over, her presence stamped on every corner. The walls were adorned with art that clashed with my taste, and the furniture had been rearranged to suit her whims. It was as if she was erasing me, piece by piece. I stood in the living room, my heart heavy with a mix of anger and despair. Celeste entered, a triumphant smile on her face. "How do you like the changes?" she asked, her tone dripping with false cheer. I clenched my jaw, struggling to keep my composure. "This isn't your place, Celeste. You need to leave." She laughed, a sound that grated on my nerves. "Oh, Morgan, you're so naive. This is just as much mine as it is yours now." Her words were a slap, a reminder of how far things had spiraled out of control. I needed to regain my footing, to reclaim what was mine. But as I surveyed the room, the task felt insurmountable. I turned away, needing air, space to think. I found myself wandering the city streets, the familiar sights offering little comfort. I ended up at a park, collapsing onto a bench as the weight of everything pressed down on me. Ethan found me there, as if he had sensed my distress. He sat beside me, silent at first, his presence a balm to my frayed nerves. "What happened?" he finally asked, his voice gentle. I shook my head, unable to find the words. "It's all falling apart, Ethan. I thought I could handle it, but now, I don't know." He listened, his expression thoughtful. "You've been carrying a lot on your shoulders. Maybe it's time to let some of it go." His words struck a chord, echoing the inner turmoil I'd been wrestling with. I had been so focused on saving my family that I'd lost sight of myself. But how could I let go when everything was unraveling? As if sensing my hesitation, Ethan continued. "Sometimes, the best way to protect the ones we love is to take care of ourselves first." I nodded, though the path forward still seemed unclear. We sat in silence, the weight of the moment hanging between us. It was then that my phone buzzed, a message from Lorraine. "Urgent. Come home." I stood abruptly, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and urgency. Ethan followed, his concern evident. "I'll come with you," he offered, and I nodded, grateful for his support. When we arrived at my parents' house, Lorraine was waiting, her expression grave. "It's Russell," she said, her voice trembling. "He's been in an accident." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt the world tilt, my mind struggling to process. "What happened?" She shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "He was distracted, not paying attention. A car came out of nowhere." I felt my knees give way, and Ethan caught me, his grip steadying. This was the twist I hadn't seen coming, a complication that made everything feel even more hopeless. We rushed to the hospital, the journey a blur of fear and anxiety. When we arrived, the sterile corridors and harsh fluorescent lights did little to calm my nerves. We found Russell in a room, his face bruised and bandaged, a shadow of the man I knew. As I stood by his bedside, the reality of the situation hit me. This was my lowest point, the moment when success or resolution seemed almost impossible. I had been so focused on fighting Celeste that I hadn't seen the toll it was taking on my father. Lorraine stood beside me, her hand squeezing mine. "He's going to be okay," she said, though her voice wavered. I nodded, though my heart was heavy with doubt. I had to believe he would recover, that we could rebuild from this. But the path forward felt more uncertain than ever. As we left the hospital, Ethan by my side, I realized my understanding of revenge and protection was being tested in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had to find a way to let go of the anger and focus on what truly mattered, my family's healing and my own. But even as I resolved to move forward, the shadow of Celeste loomed large. I knew the battle wasn't over, and I would need every ounce of strength to face what lay ahead. The hospital room was quiet, save for the steady beeping of the monitors. Russell lay in the bed, his face pale and drawn, a stark reminder of how close we had come to losing him. I stood by the window, staring out at the city skyline, my mind a jumble of fear and determination. Ethan was there, a steady presence beside me, his hand on my shoulder. Lorraine sat on the other side of the bed, her eyes never leaving Russell's face. We were a family united in crisis, but the shadow of Celeste loomed large, threatening to tear us apart. As if summoned by my thoughts, Celeste appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully composed. "I heard about the accident," she said, her voice smooth and untroubled. "I came to see how he was doing." I turned to face her, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and resolve. "You've done enough, Celeste. You need to leave." She tilted her head, a smile playing on her lips. "I'm just here to help, Morgan. You know how much I care about Russell." Her words were a knife, twisting the tension in the room. I took a step forward, my gaze steady. "You care about what he can give you, not about him." Celeste's eyes narrowed, her facade slipping for a moment. "You think you know everything, don't you? But you're just a child playing in a world you don't understand." The words stung, but I refused to back down. "I know enough to see through you." You've been manipulating him from the start. She laughed, a brittle sound that filled the room. And what are you going to do about it? You can't stop me. I glanced at Lorraine, drawing strength from her quiet presence. Actually, I can, I said, my voice calm and steady. Russell knows the truth now. We all do. Celeste's smile faltered, her confidence wavering. He won't believe you. He needs me. He needed you because you made him believe he was weak, I shot back. But he's stronger than you think. The tension in the room was palpable, each word a challenge, a test of wills. I could see the doubt creeping into Celeste's eyes, the realization that her control was slipping. Ethan stepped forward, his voice firm. It's over, Celeste. You can't manipulate your way out of this. She turned to him, her expression a mix of anger and desperation. And who are you to say that? You're just a bystander in all this. He met her gaze, unflinching. I'm someone who cares about this family, and I won't let you tear it apart. The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Celeste's facade cracked, her vulnerability showing through. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her, trapped in her own web of deceit. But then she straightened, her expression hardening. You think you've won, but this isn't over. I shook my head, my resolve unwavering. It is over, Celeste. You can't hurt us anymore. She hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Then, with a final defiant glare, she turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. As the door closed behind her, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The confrontation was over, but the journey to healing was just beginning. I turned back to Russell, who was stirring, his eyes fluttering open. Lorraine leaned forward, her voice soft and soothing. Russell, we're here. Everything's going to be all right. He blinked, his gaze shifting to me, then to Ethan. Morgan, he croaked, his voice weak but filled with gratitude. Thank you. I smiled, relief flooding through me. We're going to be okay, Dad. We'll get through this together. As I stood there, surrounded by the people I loved, I realized that true justice wasn't about revenge or retribution. It was about healing, about finding the strength to move forward and rebuild what had been broken. The experience had tested me, challenged my perceptions of right and wrong. But in the end, it had also brought us closer, reminding us of the bonds that held us together. And as I looked around the room, I knew that no matter what lay ahead, we would face it as a family, stronger and more resilient than ever before. The days following the confrontation with Celeste were a blur of quiet recovery and reflection. Russell was on the mend, both physically and emotionally, and the hospital visits became a time for healing conversations and unspoken forgiveness. One afternoon, as I sat by his bedside, Russell turned to me, his voice still a bit raspy. Morgan, I owe you an apology. I let my ego and insecurities blind me. I shook my head, placing a hand on his. We all make mistakes, Dad. What matters is that you're here now, ready to move forward. He nodded, a hint of a smile on his lips. Thanks to you. You've shown more strength than I ever could have imagined. His words warmed my heart, a balm for the wounds of the past few months. We were on the path to rebuilding, and the future seemed a little brighter with each passing day. Back at home, Lorraine was in the garden, tending to her beloved roses. I joined her, the familiar scent of earth and flowers wrapping around us like a comforting embrace. She glanced up, a serene expression on her face. I've been thinking, Morgan. It's time for me to pursue some dreams of my own. I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What do you mean? She set down her trowel, brushing soil from her hands. I've always wanted to travel, see the places I've only read about. I think it's time I did. The idea filled me with both excitement and a touch of sadness. You deserve it, Mom. You've spent so long taking care of everyone else. Lorraine smiled, her eyes twinkling with a newfound determination. And it's time I took care of myself. Her decision was inspiring, a reminder that life was about growth and change, even when it seemed daunting. As we sat together, I realized that her journey was as much about healing as mine was. Ethan and I found ourselves spending more time together, his presence a steadying force in the midst of the upheaval. One evening, we walked along the river, the city lights shimmering on the water. I'm proud of you, Morgan, he said, his voice low and sincere. You've been through so much, and yet you've come out stronger. I smiled, leaning into him. I couldn't have done it without you. He wrapped an arm around me, pulling me close. What's next for you? The question lingered in the air, a reminder of the job offer that still sat unanswered in my inbox. I had been so focused on the present that I hadn't allowed myself to think about the future. I don't know, I admitted, the words both liberating and terrifying. But I think I'm ready to find out. Ethan nodded, his gaze warm and supportive. Whatever you choose, I'll be here. His words were a promise, a reassurance that I wasn't alone in this journey. As we walked, the path ahead seemed less daunting, the possibilities endless. In the days that followed, I began to make decisions, small steps toward a future I was finally ready to embrace. I accepted the job offer, excited to start a new chapter, but with the understanding that my family would always be my anchor. The day I packed up my apartment, Lorraine and Russell came to help. As we boxed up memories, there was a sense of closure, a feeling that we were all ready to move forward. Before I left, Lorraine pulled me into a hug, her voice filled with emotion. I'm so proud of you, Morgan. You've shown us what it means to be strong. I hugged her back, my heart full. I learned from the best. As I drove away, the city fading in my rearview mirror, I felt a mix of anticipation and nostalgia. I was leaving behind a chapter of my life, but carrying with me the lessons and love that had shaped me. As I settled into my new life, I often thought of Celeste. Her departure had left a mark, a reminder of the complexities of human nature and the power of redemption. I hoped she found peace, just as we had. In the end, the journey had taught me that true justice was not about revenge, but about finding strength in vulnerability. And that protection sometimes meant letting go. It was a lesson I carried with me, a guiding light as I faced whatever came next.